Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 23, verse 1 through 25, verse 18. Is there a connection to the Exodus and the story of Abraham's servant finding a wife for Isaac?
I think if we are attentive readers of the whole Genesis narrative, we're going to find multiple episodes where Moses is recording the events that are happening in ways that are reminiscent of the Exodus to come, Israel's journey out of the land of Egypt back to the Promised Land. And this is really something that should not surprise us. Remember that Moses is the one who is writing the book of Genesis. He's writing it during the period of Israel's wilderness wanderings. And so Israel that has just experienced this Exodus is the one who is receiving and ultimately reading these historical accounts that Moses is providing of their early patriarchal history. So as we read Genesis, we see these events where Moses seems to be arranging the narrative details, the true historical details, but presenting them in a way that would call the reader to recall the events of the Exodus, particularly if you're an Israelite who just lived through that. And I think Genesis 24 is another one of these examples. You have in Genesis 24 a father who is trying to procure a bride for his son. And we see these points of correspondence. Abraham tells his servant to go to this foreign land to bring back a bride to the Promised Land. The servant is the title that Moses himself receives. He's called the servant. It's interesting in Genesis 24, the servant of Abraham is not named. He's just called the servant. And for a man who is so significantly featured in a narrative in which so many people, even in random genealogies, get named, and random, I don't mean that they have no purpose, but they don't play a large part in the rest of the biblical narrative per se. It's interesting that this servant doesn't get named. He's just called servant, which is the title that later gets applied to Moses. Like when Moses receives his commissioning to go to Egypt and bring out Israel, so this servant, when Abraham commissions him, he has an objection. Moses will say, I'm slow of speech. I don't think I'm the right person to send. The servant of Abraham says, well, what if the woman refuses to go with me? And the response is, from Abraham, the angel of the Lord will go before you and make your mission a success. Well, in Exodus chapter 23, we find, behold, God saying, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way, to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. So you've got this, again, idea of the angel of the Lord going before the people as they go on this exodus. That seems to be prefigured in Abraham's commissioning of his servant who's going to go procure a bride from a foreign land, and the angel of the Lord will be with him and go before him. So I think what we see, if we were to kind of put all that together, and then the servant goes, he gets this bride, and she comes out believing in God's promises by faith. We have a father who commissions a servant to go procure a bride from a foreign land from his son. The bride comes out of this foreign land, and if by faith the bride believes in the promises of Abraham and models the faith of Abraham, then the bride will receive the promises that are given to Abraham. Well, that sounds a lot like the future that Israel has in store, that if they will be called out from a land of their bondage, a foreign land, by a servant as the bride of God, to come to a land of promise, and if they will believe in those promises by faith, they will receive the promises of Abraham. So I think that there are elements of this story of Rebekah that would call an Israelite's attention to the story of their own exodus from Egypt and remind them this is what it means to be the people of God.
Can you talk more about the danger of spiritual regression you mentioned in your sermon found at the beginning of chapter 24?
When we look at the church today, we see that there is a whole host of spiritual dangers, but one of the most prevalent today is what we would call spiritual deconstruction. The process by which somebody who has grown up around Christian faith, has grown up in the church, has often made a profession of faith and belief at some point later in life, and right now very commonly in the collegiate years or early professional kind of age of life, begins to question and then slowly deconstruct key elements of their faith and of their belief. They slowly begin to doubt certain doctrines of the church, and then eventually the whole faith kind of comes apart. And so it's almost this walking backwards of this spiritual road that they've been down, that they profess faith, and then piece by piece they slowly break it apart and then abandon it altogether. And of course, I believe that reveals that this person never genuinely had faith to begin with, that they may have made an intellectual profession of faith at an earlier part of their life, but that wasn't actually the work of God in them. Nonetheless, it's that kind of spiritual regression that is becoming characteristic of so many people in our time, which is why the apostles tell us to work out our faith with fear and trembling, to ensure that what we profess to believe is actually manifest in our lives through things like the fruit of the Spirit, and whether or not are you living under a delusion of a merely intellectual assent to a set of propositions, or are you actually living a faith that is revealed in the fruit that you're bearing in your life? I think that is somewhat exemplified for us in Abraham's concern for Isaac, that if Isaac's allowed to go back to the land of Ur and depart from the land of promise, that there's a spiritual danger for his son, that Isaac will regress to be comfortable living in the land that all of his old family are in, that all of his kinsmen are in. They're more like him than the Canaanite people. But there's danger there, because as we'll find out when they go back to the land, people like Laban are living there, and Laban is an idol worshiper. Abraham's family, before he was called out of the land of Ur, they were idol worshiping people beyond the river. So if Isaac goes back, is the faith of Abraham going to continue and be passed on generation to generation, or is Abraham's family going to revert back to the pagan idol worshiping practices of the family that Abraham was called out of? That dangerous spiritual regression we would do well to learn from and consider for ourselves and for our own children. What ways are we examining our own lives to ensure that we are walking in a way that isn't simply a profession of faith, but that is actually fruitful? And what ways are we guarding ourselves and our children against this spiritual deconstruction that is so rampant in our time?
Does Genesis 24 give us a prescriptive model for dating?
The answer to that is no, right? So we're not called to necessarily have these sort of arranged marriages that we see being exemplified here, nor is it as simple as saying we're going to pray this prayer and we're going to set within this prayer kind of a test or some sort of sign that we're praying that God, if you were to give me this particular indicator, I would know that person is the person for me. We can be over quick to overread things in life that we want to say, okay, that's a clear sign from God that I'm supposed to marry this person, or that person's the one for me. In reality, I think living in the will of God means that we walk by faith in the uncertainties that mark our human finite existence, knowing that we don't always have a clear indication in these sort of decisions that we have to make in everyday life about what the right, quote unquote, choice is. But I think in reality, we need to be less concerned about what the right choice is, in terms of, is there a one correct choice and all other choices would be incorrect? I don't think that's the way that it works. Instead, we're called to make decisions that reflect wisdom and discernment and that exercise Christian responsibility. And then once we make those commitments, to walk them out well for the glory of God. So does that mean that you have to wait for the sign that reveals that person is the person that you should marry? No. Does that, however, mean that you should apply good wisdom principles to protect yourself spiritually in a potential marriage to someone else? Yes. So there are practical things that we can take over from Abraham's concern. You shouldn't be unequally yoked with a Canaanite, is his concern for his son. Well, we can apply that principle to practices of Christian dating as well. It is unwise to be spiritually unequally yoked with someone. If the most important thing about you is what you believe about God, and it is, then you shouldn't be married to someone who fundamentally believes something differently about God, or maybe doesn't even believe that God exists at all. The most important thing about you is now completely out of alignment. So that's a good practice that we can have in place. But praying, hey, the third person who comes out of the doors of Walmart, that's the person, God, that you'd have me to marry. That is not a good application of this text. There are some things in this text that are descriptive of a time in the patriarchal history that are unique, when God is speaking directly with the patriarchs and is sending his angel before them because they are the unique emissaries of his redemptive plan. And so we need to recognize the descriptive uniqueness. And then there are some more prescriptive principles that we can draw an application out of the text, like the dangers of being spiritually unequally yoked with those who are outside of the promises of God.
Is there anything significant about the blessing that Rebekah's family gives her?
I think that there is. So if we look down the latter part of chapter 24, as Rebekah is preparing to leave with Abraham's servant, her family says to her, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." So in other words, may your offspring possess the gate of his enemies. Now, what's so significant about that is we've heard almost that exact phrase before. The angel of the Lord who stops Abraham from offering up his son Isaac says to him, "Your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemy." So that promise anticipates that from Isaac is going to come this promised one who's going to defeat the serpent and who ultimately is going to defeat and overcome his enemies. Well, just a couple chapters later, this wife for Isaac, her family, who doesn't know anything about that speech that the angel has made and who themselves are not worshipers of the one true God, they have this kind of prophetic insight that they speak over Rebekah, that her offspring, singular, will possess the gate of those who hate him. Again, third person singular. So it's that same promise. And then they preface that, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s." Well, that's something that's going to reverberate particularly in David's life as a refrain that's going to be spoken and sung over him frequently. And so there's this anticipation of this great warrior king to come from this line who's going to defeat his enemies. Well, that's going to be initially sort of typified in David, but David's own life is going to be a type of a greater king to come from his own family, which will come in Christ, who will finally possess the gate of his enemy. As we read in 1 Corinthians 15, the final enemy is death. Christ will, as he tells his disciples, prevail, his church will prevail, and the gates of Hades, the gates of death, will not prevail against him. Why? Because it is he who will possess the gate of his enemy. He's the one who will overthrow death itself, and therefore the church will prevail against the gates of death.
Why are we given Ishmael's family tree in Genesis 25 if he's leaving the storyline?
Yeah, it's sort of odd, right? That in the moment where Ishmael's really just about to pass out of the rest of the narrative of Genesis, that we have his genealogy given to us. But it reminds us at the close of Abraham's life that God made promises to Abraham beyond just the promises that would be distributed through Isaac. So we'll recall that when the issue of Isaac's coming is still in waiting and God is promising to make Abraham a great nation, Abraham says, "God, just do it through Ishmael. I have a son already. I have Ishmael through Hagar. Make him into this great nation." God says, "No, it's going to be through Sarah via this son that you will name Isaac. But for your sake, I will also be kind to Ishmael, and I will make him a great nation." But there's still a consequence for Abraham and Sarah's sinful plot to figure out some alternative way to produce the promises through their own effort, through this plan utilizing Hagar. And as a result of that sin, there are these ongoing generational consequences that Ishmael's sons, that will grow into these 12 princes, that are sort of these mirror reflections of the 12 tribes of Israel through Isaac, but the princes are less because the Abrahamic line through Isaac is going to be a kingly line. Ishmael's line is merely a princely line, so it's already, the promises are inferior that are given to Ishmael. There's also this promise of ongoing conflict. Ishmael's hand will be against his brother. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. It reveals there will be an ongoing seed of conflict between Ishmael and Isaac and between the nations that will come from them. So Ishmael's children will grow up into these nations. They're going to be the people that Israel will be constantly dealing with and fighting with as they endeavor to lay hold of the land of promise.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.